We are not people of stone. It wasn't stone tablets that got us any place. If anything, it put something around our necks that could be drowning us, quite frankly. We are not people of stone. We are people of the Spirit. And he's looking at these guys they're into the stone. Whatever is etched in stone, that's the way it is. So in Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40.
But when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him, and saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. The second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets.
And over in Mark 12, which is the parallel story, verses 29 through 31.
Jesus answered, The foremost is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these.
Mark has him reciting the full Shema. The Shema is one of the two prayers that is required on a daily basis by every Jew. So it's a little bit different, but it's not really. Matthew just picks it up from after the Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. But you notice Jesus adds something they're not asking. He says the second is like it, and they weren't asking him for the first and the second, or two great ones or anything. They asked him for one. But he feeds into it and says the second is, and he gives them something else from the Mosaic Law. So it's like he's saying more than what they asked for. But he's still in the law. He's still in their language. He's still in a legal conversation, so to speak. But he wasn't asked to give a dissertation on the law, just the greatest one, the first one, if you would. Romans 13 is good to read. Somebody want to go to Romans 13? I'll give you two verses once you get there. Romans 13, verses 8 and 10. You guys know this is Paul writing to the Romans and what he has to say. Romans 13, verses 8 and 10.
Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. And then 10 is, love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law.
Beautiful verses. You want to fulfill the law? It's not a matter of going there. If you want to fulfill the law, it's a matter of loving one another. That's it. Jesus knows that. Paul's picked up on that. Because what Jesus is actually doing is he's letting them know the Shema has to do with their vertical relationship with God, to love the Lord thy God with all their heart, with all their mind, with all their soul, with all their strength. It has to do with that. And then he moves in and says, but the second is like that. It's exactly the same, to love your neighbor. That becomes huge. Saying, well, here's the deal. And John says this, doesn't he, in his epistle. You say you love God who you haven't seen, but you don't love your brother. I'm just wondering, how is it that you love God who you have not seen, but yet you don't love your brother who you do? And John does the same thing. He yanks us into this world of loving God and loving one another is the same thing. That will rock, absolutely rock lawyers. That does not work very well. That does not run very good. No, those are two different things. And Jesus is saying, no, actually they're the same thing. But we just want one great one. Give us the greatest one, the great one. See, notice in Mark, he says point blank. He calls them one commandment. This commandment, this one, are these. In Matthew, he uses an interesting expression that, to be honest with you, it wasn't until this last week, I wasn't really even thinking much about it. He says that, upon these hang all the law and the prophets. And I thought, what's he talking about? What do you mean it hangs? The Jews, in Jerusalem, around town they would have had like pegs in the building walls. And they would actually hang the law, so to speak, so that as people were walking up and down the streets, they could see them hanging on these pegs. So you couldn't go very far before you would, if your left or your right, you would see it hanging there. Now, whether Jesus is standing there and looking at one of those pegs where the law and the prophets are hanging there, but the peg that holds them up, he's saying, is love. Whether that's the case, I gravitate a little bit more towards, because this, I got to thinking this way, because at first I thought, what's some kind of an expression, but it's not an expression. He meant what he said, hanging, something hanging. In the next chapter, there's a whole bunch of woes against the Pharisees for their hypocrisy, for their commitment to the external, a whole bunch of different things. And one of the things he takes issue with them is their phylacteries, which mean very little to probably any of us here in this room. You know how the Pharisees had their beautiful robes? Jesus takes issue with that too. You know, you got these gorgeous robes, you look one way, but underneath those robes, we all know you are just filled with nasty little things running around. But nobody knows that. You've got these long prayers in public. You give the appearance, you know. I've done this, I've done that, I can do, you know. He really takes issue. One of the things he takes issues with them is their phylacteries. Now, what a phylactery was, it was a little leather box. And what the Pharisees would do was they take this little leather box, and in it would be what they considered their most valuable scriptures. And what was always in every Pharisee's box, they might have different things in there, but you'd always find the Shema. And then they would take these little leather boxes. Some would actually strap them around their head so you could see it on their forehead. And some would wear really big boxes, because you know what that means? There's a lot of word in that guy. A lot of them, more than wore the ones on that box on the head, they hung them around their neck. That's where they were hanging. So you see Jesus saying, you know, upon this, love hangs everything. It should be. He might as well have been saying to them, look, Leviticus 19:18 says that you should love your neighbor as yourself, and you guys want to kill me. But yet, you wear these things around your neck, and I'm telling you, love is the thing that should be wearing that. Which probably gets a little bit more to your point. He never puts down the law, he just says he came to complete it. He came to correct it. He came to get it working in the right. But the point is, when he says, it's all hanging, he's looking at a whole bunch of these guys, they got stuff hanging around their necks. But they are not lovers by any means. And they should be, because that's what it should be hanging on. All the law and the prophets. You see, what I put down here is wilderness worship. Out in the wilderness, they're into a god of stone. They're into laws that are written in stone. That's wilderness worship. No real relationship. It's wilderness, it's stone. Give me stone. Give me something that I can stand on. I'm not saying that that's wrong. Jesus just sort of indicates that that's the first. But there's a second, which is not a to-do list. The second is the law of the Spirit, which never calls for anybody to be stoned. It's interesting that the stone law calls for stoning of people. Yeah? It's etched away on stone, and that's what we do, is stone each other. The second one's not like the second one is love, which is of the Spirit, where there is no stoning. We don't stone one another because every single one of us falls short of the glory of God. It comes as no surprise to God. Did Jesus overcome the wilderness tests by the law or by the Spirit? Well, the answer is obviously both. He quotes the law in the wilderness, because that's where he is, in the wilderness with the enemy. It's where Israel still is in the wilderness with the enemy. But it makes it very clear he was led of the Spirit into the wilderness. And in Luke 4 it says he came out of the wilderness empowered by the Spirit. It wasn't just a word attack. And I've heard that message preached so many times I wish I'd never heard it again. I've heard it over and over again. Well, you better know the word so you can fight the enemy. Well, I would agree that it's great to know the word. But it wasn't just the power of the word, it was the power of the Spirit. It was both. You see, the second spirit of the law, an Old Testament prophet, Zechariah, had said it. Zechariah is the prophet who said, "Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit," said the Lord, that the foundation of the building that God was building was grace, the temple, grace. This is the same prophet in Zechariah 7, verses 8 through 12.
Then the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, saying, Thus has the Lord of hosts said, Dispense true justice and practice kindness and compassion each to his brother, and do not oppress the widow or the orphan, the stranger or the poor, and do not devise evil in your heart against one another. But they refused to pay attention and turned a stubborn shoulder and stopped their ears from hearing. And they made their hearts like flint, so that they could not hear the law, and that the words of the Lord of hosts had sent by his Spirit to the former prophets. Therefore great wrath came from the Lord of hosts.
Jesus levels the playing field. And it just becomes interesting that all these law lovers, so to speak, they had hearts of stone, because that's what had happened. They turned to stone, because that's what they embraced, was stone instead of the Spirit. And Jesus is standing there, full of the Spirit, trying to share that Spirit with them, calling them to a place to move beyond the stone into the Spirit so they could truly worship God. Do you remember what Jesus said about true worship? It becomes fascinating, because he's talking to this woman about worship, that worship him in spirit and in truth. God is spirit. It's a beautiful thing that he's saying to her, because she's sincerely wondering about worship. Well, let me tell you, sweetie, she's not asking about the law. She's not interested in the law. She's interested in love and worship. He leads her, he engages her into a place of love and worship, that's what it's about. And both the Samaritans and the Jews, both of them, were far from that place.